My name is Joshua Jacobo. I'm a monumental marble sculptor and the founder of New Masters Academy, the world's leading online art school, affordable and accessible to students around the world at nma.art. We are here in Philadelphia, and I'm extremely excited because I get to present research that I've been working on for over a year, which is completely game-changing for artists, archaeologists, and art historians around the world. The original Canon of Proportions by Polycleitus, an ancient Greek 5th century BCE sculptor, is the most important document in the history of figure art. It's the first time that beauty has been defined, it's the birth of aesthetics, and it is the origin of the word canon that we use for canons of proportions, canonical. This all comes from Polycleitus' original document. That's the good news. The bad news is, unfortunately, this document was lost to time, and scholars, art historians, and artists have been trying to reconstruct it for millennia. Most notably, in recent centuries, the neoclassical artist Gottfried Shadow, there's been an entire symposium where the top scholars in this field have tried to figure out what this lost canon of proportions might have been. So we don't have the document, but we do have Roman copies of these lost sculptures that we know from ancient sources were part of the illustration of this. And so scholars have been trying to reverse engineer it for ages and been unsuccessful. We're excited to say that we have successfully reverse engineered it. And after more than a year of research, I'm finally getting the opportunity, and I'm honored to present it to the American Institute of Archaeology and the Society for Classical Studies.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Lynn. I'm very excited to welcome you all and our wonderful presenters here to this session entitled Educating with Antiquities. Without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Joshua Jacobo from New Masters Academy to present his paper entitled Solving the Doryphoros Canon, a new interdisciplinary analysis of Polykleitos' figure art proportions and its impact on art education.
Well, hello, and thank you to the Archaeological Institute of America for inviting me to share my insights today. This paper is about the reconstruction of Polykleitos' canon, a classical ancient Greek system of proportions of the human figure that was outlined in a treatise written by the sculptor Polycleitus and illustrated through a series of sculptures produced by Polycleitus and copied by other artists through history. While Polycleitus' original treatise and measurements have been lost, the proportions outlined by Polycleitus have impacted the production of art for millennia, as his methods of proportions were taught by master to student for centuries. The work of Leonardo da Vinci, for example, was impacted by the Canon of Polykleitos. By accurately reconstructing the canon, something that has eluded scholars for centuries, we change the way we understand sculptural history, the production of art through the last 2 millennia, particularly from ancient Greece to the Renaissance, and it could impact the way we teach artists today how to depict the ideal human form. The human figure holds a unique place in art, serving both as a critical subject in art education and as a profound mirror reflecting our deepest selves or constructed personas. Its psychological impact and significance in art are unmatched. Humans have heightened sensitivity to the human form, and we're finely attuned to detect minute differences in human faces and bodies, which makes accurately depicting the human figure a formidable task. Achieving a convincing portrayal demands precise control over the lengths, angles, and scales of the body parts relative to one another, a skill that is challenging to master. At the Academy, we teach our students the study of human proportions and symmetry, a discipline grounded in this ancient tradition that seeks to understand the ideal or appropriate configurations of body parts relative to each other. At New Masters Academy, our approach to teaching human proportions is deeply rooted in the historic tradition that has been passed down through generations of artists, though its level of precision has degraded significantly over time, particularly in the 20th century, as many art students today are taught overly simplified methods for depicting the human form without an understanding of where such proportions of the figure came from or why such a system should be used. Today, the most prevalent method among artists for addressing the challenges of depicting the human form is the head height system, which typically uses the head as a base unit, often constituting 1/8 of the body's total height. This system can be seen in this 18th century illustration by Jacob DeWitt, shown in the center of the slide, which contrasts sharply with the 20th century illustration by Andrew Loomis, which pains me to say is probably the most used proportional illustration among artists today, right here. On the left side, you'll recognize one of the world's most iconic drawings, the Vitruvian Man, by the Renaissance master Leonardo da Vinci. This drawing is named for its basis in the ancient descriptions of human proportions attributed to Greek artists that survive in the works of Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, a 1st century AD Roman military architect and engineer. Vitruvius's writings on human proportions, though valuable and influential to artists and art historians, do not match the significance of Polycleitus' canon. Polycleitus was a 5th century BCE sculptor who wrote a famous treatise on human proportions, the Canon, which is also where we get the current usage today of the word canon. That's coming from Polycleitus, which comes from measuring rod or standard. This is the most impactful study of the depiction of the human form in art history. While Polycleitus' original treatise was lost from other references, we know that he outlined a system of proportions of the human figure, which he accompanied with sculptures that illustrated his system. For centuries, this system has had an enormous impact on the depiction of the human form in art. Artists passed down Polycleitus' measurements of proportion in their own works from master to student. Today, the treatise is lost, and we have only copies of Polycleitus' educational sculpture. The oldest are Roman copies of the original. You can see 2 of those here. The most famous of these sculptures, believed to be the Doryphoros, or spear bearer, shown on the left in the slide, survives only in Roman copies. Unlike Vitruvius, who was not a sculptor and described Greek methods secondhand centuries later, Polycleitus' canon offered a direct, formalized classical guideline for constructing the figure in art. Despite the original document's loss, artists and scholars have persistently tried to reverse engineer the Doryphoros to uncover its underlying principles. This endeavor was highlighted by a dedicated symposium in 1989 at the University of Wisconsin and Minneapolis Institute of Art, extensively covered in the book Polycleitus, the Doryphoros and Tradition. Yet despite such intense interest, including efforts by neoclassical figures like Gottfried Schadow in the 19th century, a comprehensive understanding of the canon's design has remained elusive, with problems in the interpretation of the canon. As a figure specialist and independent scholar of historical art methods, I undertook my own reverse engineering of the Doryphoros to benefit our students and the broader international and art historical communities. Given the loss of the canon treatise, which outlined exact proportions of the perfect human figure, our primary goal was to reverse engineer Polycleitus' principles, reconstructing them through a close study of the surviving Roman copies of the Doryphoros sculptures. If we succeeded, we would finally have an accurate reconstruction of the proportions that have been so important to the production of art for 2 millennia, affecting not only our understanding of art history and the historic traditions of art production, but also the way we teach art today. While other scholars have had a similar idea to recreate the canon through a study of Polycleitus' sculptures, the task has remained formidable into the 20th century without modern technology to assist reconstruction. For example, a theory proposed by Richard Tobin in the 1970s, which is still cited on Wikipedia on the articles for the canon and for Polycleitus, has been critically evaluated and found lacking in our investigations, both conceptually and in the specific measurements taken from these sculptures. For our purposes, we realize that the key challenges scholars have had historically in identifying the correct measurements of Polycleitus include identifying precise points for measurement, establishing comparative metrics, and accurately executing these measurements. By using modern technology in our effort to reconstruct the canon, our techniques varied from orthographic measurements, akin to drawing views like plans or elevations on the face of a stone block in sculpture, to 3-dimensional measurements using tools like calipers or compasses, as practiced in daily art production by sculptors, including myself and my wife. In keeping with the ancient methods and conjectures by scholars, we found that only orthographic rather than 3D measurements yielded accurate results. To enhance the precision of our work, we utilized 3D scan data provided by museums, and in the case of the Museum of Archaeology in Naples, performed by our team directly, as you can see on the slide on the right, as well as 3D printed models derived from these scans. Our scans focused on the surviving copies of the Doryphoros, or the Doryphoros, which are the closest historical survivors to Polycleitus' original educational works. The image on the right illustrates a point cloud. That's all these little points here. Maybe some of you are familiar with this. Amid numerous blue rectangles, each indicating a camera's position during the photogrammetric reconstruction process. This specific model reconstructs the Doryphoros house at the Naples Museum of Archaeology, discovered at Pompeii, by taking hundreds of high-resolution photos. Specialized software employs photogrammetry to build highly accurate models. Our research also benefited from scans conducted on various Doryphoros copies by institutions like the Uffizi Gallery in Florence and the National Museum of Denmark, which provided us a 3D scan of the plaster cast from the Naples Doryphoros. For today's analysis, we relied primarily on the SMK plaster cast scan of the Naples Doryphoros copy due to its completeness and the high resolution required for our tolerances. All data has proven invaluable. We are grateful for the collaboration of these institutions. A future project might include comparative analysis using newer, higher resolution scans to further refine our findings. This approach has allowed us to minimize distortions that typically arise from photography, or manual measurement errors, ensuring a more accurate reconstructions. And this is something that's a typical problem where you have like grids drawn over photographs, because every photograph has an inherent lens distortion, which is not able to be removed. So there's actually no way to get an orthographic photograph. You'd have to have a very long lens and be very far away. But even then, it's not going to line up to the tolerances that we're talking about here. So we actually think that this problem of people like Tobin and previous scholars just not knowing which points to measure or how to measure it, and also without like the block of stone that was originally there, this orthographic cardinal planes of the front, the side, the rear, without those planes, because the sculpture has had those removed, we have to essentially reconstruct a planar elevation view from an architectural standpoint, which is very difficult to do. And that's part of the reason we think it's been so difficult to reverse engineer this without the treatise. We began our reconstruction by using evidence of proportional systems in use before the canon, specifically focusing on the grid systems of the ancient Egyptians, as well as by later sources such as the descriptions of Vitruvius. The reasons for this are important. Polycleitus himself did not invent human artistic proportions in a vacuum. Polycleitus was working within the existing traditions for depicting the human form, particularly those passed down from the Egyptians, which would have underpinned his own revelations on proportion, which of course he later presented in his canon. As part of our research, we reviewed ancient textual sources that describe the canon, such as Galen and Pliny the Elder. The approach involved checking proportional relationships and prescriptions before and after the canon to the canon to determine whether a rule is borne out by the measurements of our 3D scans. Looking at Egyptian tradition, ancient Egyptians designed their artwork, whether 2D or 3D media, as outline designs on grids. This is also referred to as artistic outlines in the translation by scholars talking about the Polycleitus canon. So typically today, when artists talk about proportions, we're thinking of almost like a stick figure, like this is the length from here to here, and that's as far as proportions tend to go in the artistic practice. But we believe that these artistic outlines, in other words, every single curve that chains together to form every profile, which gets projected into the block or built up in clay by the chloroplast, those actual curves are actually the designs, and they're one and the same with the proportions. You can't really abstract away the outlines from the grid, just as we see in ancient Egyptian examples where we see strong evidence throughout the Middle and Late Kingdoms. And I've actually seen evidence from a recent trip to Egypt on Old Kingdom as well. This is the method that we think was still in use by Polycleitus. Ancient Egyptians designed their artwork, whether 2D or 3D media, as outline designs on grids. This is also the same way they organized their writing system and mathematics, similarly to other ancient cultures. The horizontal and vertical registers, so the actual horizontals and verticals of the grid, provide a specific framework onto which the curves of the design could be drawn, painted, carved in relief, or by placing these grids on different faces of a prism carved in the round. And there are many examples of this that may even be training examples in ancient Egyptian workshops where you actually see the stages. You can see this at museums in Cairo, for example. Prism, essentially, a grid drawn on it, and then the profiles get extruded and then rounded out, and that's how you get sculpture. And that is still today how traditional sculpture is done. It across many traditions, from Hindu and Buddhist art. There, many practitioners still carve the same way. You have your block, you draw the designs on a grid in this case, and then you sort of project them into the stone. The designs themselves were often done on pieces of pottery or stone called ostraka, that were cheaper than papyrus and could be done in relief. Once the design was worked out on a grid, it could be enlarged or reduced for many different applications. These grids you see over these two Egyptian figure examples are my own reconstructions. In October, I traveled to Egypt to document evidence of grids at various sites and museums, and this is an area of ongoing interest for me. In ancient Egyptian human representations, there are recurring units of measurement, such as the depth of the foot, which in these examples we can see here at 3 units wide. Now, the ancient Egyptians, you'll notice sometimes that the actual, like this is a perfectly reconstructed grid, but the way that they would do it is they actually snapped strings with a paint on them across the stone. And we can see just from the existing evidence of those strings that they weren't perfectly in alignment. And so they're reconstructing the grid, and the ostraka often were quite carefully measured, but there's some like drift that happens when they're actually transferring the grid lines onto the actual final result. In ancient Egyptian human representations, there are recurring units of measurement, such as the depth of the foot, which we can see here at 3 units wide, which would correspond with the width of the palm taken across the knuckles as 1 unit. And so that could be, depending on the position of the hand, that could be across like this. Sometimes it's even angled, as you see here. It's fascinating to consider that these proportional units were also reflected in ancient Egyptian metrology or measurement systems, from which we inherit our own systems of measurement globally today. In the bottom left image, you can see figures from an ancient Egyptian measuring rod. And I actually have a reproduction of that here, which I can pass around if you guys are interested in looking at this. You can see here that the basic unit is a finger width, which increments from 1 finger to 3. So 1, 2, 3, and then the fourth is represented as a palm. Interestingly, these same body parts are mentioned by ancient authors in respect to Greek systems of proportions, where the finger relates to each other part of the body. Galen, writing in the 2nd century, praised Polycleitus' canon, stating, "Beauty consists in the proportions, not of the elements, but of the parts. That is to say, a finger to finger, and all of the fingers to the palm and the wrist, and all of these to the forearm, and of the forearm to the upper arm, and of all of the other parts to each other." As you can see in this 3D orthographic, which means no perspective distortion, render that we did based on the scan data from the side of the Doryphoros sculpture, that these 3 units appear to be illustrated quite obviously in the specific positioning of the body parts in relationship to one another. As you can see, the depth of the foot is positioned clearly and side-on, similarly to ancient Egyptian depictions. The palm is oriented on the same horizontal axis, placed precisely such that 1 finger width overshoots the foot below. The diagram lines were created digitally to show that the finger width, indicated with the small letter A, is multiplied 4 times to create the precise width measured across the knuckles, indicated with line B. The palm width B from this view fits into the foot exactly 3 times as indicated by line C. So A is the finger width, 1, 2, 3, 4. That adds up to B, which is the palm width, and then exactly 3 of those create the length here that you see in C. And not only that, as you can see in this position here, this is a didactic sculpture, it's believed, that we have exactly 1 finger width aligned between the two. This slide helps to indicate just how visually clear these units appear to be related and how seamlessly these units fit into the ancient context of the time. Based on this discovery, we proceeded under the assumption that the base unit of the sculpture may be the finger width rather than the head height, as is the case in most contemporary applications of proportions. If this is correct, it would indicate that the level of precision of the Canon is 9 times greater than the 8-head systems most often used today. That's almost an order of magnitude more precise. Contemporary art students could benefit by learning the relationships of each body part to one another at the finger width scale, eliminating guesswork and refining and improving their figure art. Vitruvius's observations about head height have significantly influenced our approach to proportions in classical sculpture, making the head height of the Doryphoros a focal point of our study. Ancient Egyptian art often used the hairline for measurements, perhaps influenced by their elaborate headwear, suggesting that earlier cultures might not have standardized the top of the cranium as a reference point. This led us to question whether Polycleitus considered head height a critical measure. So we examined the total height of the Doryphoros against various head points, seeking a simple whole number fraction. Traditionally, Polykleitus's figures are thought to have a larger head height than those of his successor Lysippos, who is credited with the more elongated, heroic proportions of Hellenistic art, typically using a 1/8 ratio as outlined by Vitruvius. Our scans revealed that, including the hair, the head measures significantly larger than 1/8 of the total height. However, measuring from the chin to the eyes and doubling it, so this distance to this distance in contemporary proportion systems is often doubled to give you the top of the cranium, not the top of the hair or the vertex of the sculpture, but the top of the cranium. It does appear plausible that, because we can't see inside the head of the Doryphoros the way we can with some like bronze castings where the cranium's still intact and there's a hole, but it's very possible that if you were to take this measurement and double it, it appears that it could be a 1/8 figure after all, if we're excluding the hair. We looked for these measurements, but despite this, we found that it was close, but it wasn't even exactly 1/7 of the total height, which is what descriptions usually put it at. There was a slight discrepancy that highlighted the practical challenge of using a 1/7 proportion, which, unlike the more divisible 1/8 proportion, it's cumbersome to work with at any scale. Reflecting on classical Greek constructions and their discovery and use of irrational numbers, we explored the possibility that Polycleitus may have employed these in his canon. Drawing from Vitruvius's descriptions of a figure encased within a square and circle, we utilized the Pythagorean theorem to construct a nested diagram of 2 squares and a circle. In this setup, an outer square completely encases the figure. Inside this square, we inscribed a circle touching all 4 sides. Within the circle, we inscribed another square, its corners touching the circle's circumference on the inside. The diagonal of this inner square equals the circle's diameter, which means that each side of the inner square is the diameter divided by the square root of 2, ancient Greece's first irrational number and a likely subject of Polycleitus's fascination. As you can see, the space between the 2 squares perfectly encases the head and hair above, as well as in the inflection caused by the gastrocnemius and soleus calf muscles on the inside outside and rear profiles. This inner square scaling dimensions via the square root of 2 results in proportions that are not simple whole number ratios. Such irrational scaling factors, while offering a high level of precision and proportion, reflect the intricate balance and harmony esteemed in classical art and design. Remarkably, despite the complexity of irrational numbers, these proportions could be achieved using simple tools of the era, possibly with a practical construction like the one we just hypothesized here. So this can be done with a straight edge and string. I've demonstrated this before on a chalkboard. It's a pretty simple way to get a really complex value here, which is this irrational number here. We successfully utilized the units of foot, palm, and finger to break down the proportions of the Doryphoros figure as shown in this table. This table aligns with Vitruvius's descriptions, demonstrating that the total height of the Doryphoros is 6 feet, 18 palms, or 72 finger widths. Notably, the estimated cranium that I described earlier, excluding the hair, accounts for 1/8 of the total height. 2 craniums equate to 1 cubit, the distance from the outstretched fingers to the elbow, establishing a total height as 4 cubits. Similar to some ancient Egyptian measurements, the face represents 1/10 of the total height and can be divided into thirds, a common modern practice. The palm with extended fingers is also 1/10 of the total height. So we just use circles here to extend the length of the fingers. And it does appear to be, just like Vitruvius's prescriptions and really common prescriptions to this day, that this is 1/10 of the figure from the peak of the hairline to the chin. And then this is 1/10 as well, just like Vitruvius describes. These major measurements derived from the SMK 3D scan of the plaster cast of the Naples Doryphoros are presented simply and elegantly, reflecting an analytical thinking of ancient Greeks. It would be intriguing to compare these proportions with other copies of the Doryphoros to see if they conform similarly or if there are other proportions yet to be analyzed. As we've explored the precise and historically rooted proportions of the Doryphoros, let's consider now how these ancient techniques are not just of academic interest, but also hold practical implications for teaching art to artists today. At New Masters Academy, we are now incorporating these insights into our curriculum, which teaches grid-based designs and proportions using classical geometry approaches like orthographics. This method involves drawing figures without perspective using basic tools such as a compass, triangle, and straight edge, which allows students not just to sketch, but to create precise, reusable design templates of any character type that they might want. And you can see here, this is the work I'm currently doing now. So this is my illustration here. So what I'm doing here is, now that we've established the major lengths that would be sufficient for most practical applications of proportions, I actually believe that each of the individual parts of the body are also conforming to a grid, most likely the finger grid based on the scale. And so you can see here, this is the type of plan and elevation that we're talking about when we talk about sculpture and prisms and projecting inward. This is sort of the ancient Egyptian sort of way to do a sculpture, but we actually think that this is going to yield results. So we've actually done so far the foot, the hand, and the head, and I'm going to hopefully be presenting that work in the future. So we're expanding our educational offerings by applying the proportional analysis gleaned from our study of the Doryphoros. This methodical approach to studying the historical sculptures, akin to practices during the Renaissance and neoclassical periods, has profound implications. We encourage other scholars to consider our methods or to extend these findings to other historical figures, fostering a deeper understanding of classical artistic measurements. Thank you. If you want to learn more about this, join us at New Masters Academy. You can go to nma.art. You sign up as a student and join us on the digital campus, which is currently on Discord, and join the conversation. I'm so excited to get this information into artists' hands around the world, and I really want to see what you can do with this as a jumping off point for your own art. Thank you for joining me.